Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host, Chris. Alongside with me is my co host, Dean, and today we're going to be talking about the afterlife, near death experiences. How are you doing today, Dean?
Feeling pretty good, man. I got my coffee. I'm really ready to go for this conversation. Let's do it.
Oh, absolutely. I'm super excited for this one because this isn't one I really think about much. I know I do, as you know, I do like my classical research.
Yeah.
So I know about the Greek afterlife, the Roman afterlife, the basics about Catholicism and Christianity. And when you put this topic forward to me, you had some more information on like other types of afterlives that people might not be exposed to.
And I'll be honest, I haven't delved too deeply into this sort of thing in a long time, but it's, everybody thinks about life and death and stuff at some one point or another. And I feel like weirdly, so I'm in my 30s now. I feel like weirdly, I used to think about it. I think about it a lot more when I was younger. I have some theories on why that is, but I'm sure I'll start thinking about it more as I get older as well. It could just be that, when you're younger, your grandparents and stuff, they're getting older. And then when you hit your like teens, at least for me, like that's when my, grandparents passed away when I was like a teenager. So like, I guess it does make sense when older people in your life start dying, you think more about it. But now, those loved ones are gone, long gone. And I'm kind of in this this weird position where I have a child now and my mom is getting older, but she's not really old yet. So there's not like really a lot of people dying around me, except I did just have a great aunt who passed away. She crazily lived to be 104 or 105. That just blows my mind thinking about that. But I think that's kind of why I wanted to bring it back to the center or bring it back to the discussion of life after death and stuff like that, because I'm starting to think about a little bit again. But I'll just briefly share a quick story about how it all started for me with life after death and thinking about it. And the earliest memory I have is driving past a graveyard on the way to my grandparents' house. It's a really small graveyard in Western Pennsylvania. Nothing out of the ordinary. It has some little mini coliseums and stuff and some above ground graves and whatever. And I remember looking at that every time we would go to my grandparents' house. And at the same time, I was also learning about Christianity and Catholicism because that's how I was, brought up. Even though I'm not a practicing Catholic or Christian anymore, I still very much know about this story, the belief system and stuff. So when I was learning about that, I would look at the graves and I remember learning like, Jesus is going to come back someday and he's going to raise everyone up from the dead and God and Jesus are going to judge everybody, good or evil or whatever. And I remember thinking like, oh, well, maybe it's better to be buried above ground then, because like, what if Jesus brought you back and you're like stuck in this heavy slab underground or something like that? Like, how do you even get out? And it never occurred to me, as a child, like, oh, there's some other, spiritual magic or something that can happen in that situation. I was literally just thinking like, oh, how would you get out of the grave? So that was really my first thought about life after death and like how the mechanics of it works and whatever, very much rooted in Christianity. But I don't know, man, do you have a similar, I'm sure you have a similar story. Like what are your earliest thoughts of like life after death that you can remember?
I would say for me, it also started at a young age. I wasn't exposed to an actual funeral or anything until maybe I was 13 years old when my grandfather passed away. So that was like the first funeral that I ever went to. So,
was it open casket?
Yeah. Yes, it was.
Yeah, that's heavy.
Yes, it was. Every funeral I've been to has been an open casket. I have not been to a closed casket funeral. Yeah. That was my first run-in with death. And it was one of those things where obviously it's a shock to the system because nothing can prepare you for it. They say time heals everything, and I don't think it does. It's something that you just don't heal from. You just kind of learn how to deal with it. You just roll with it. There's always, how they say there's always like a gaping hole missing or something like that. That tends to be the case, and you just learn how to adapt and change with it. But back to your main question, I would say maybe probably close to about maybe 8 to 10 years old is when I started thinking about life after death. And similar to you, it was hand in hand with religion and stuff like that,
Yeah.
right? I don't know about you, but growing up in a very Catholic family, like my extended family as well. And, when kids are bad, sometimes they'll say, you better behave because God's watching you. That age old line that people like to use.
That or Santa.
So that or Santa. Yeah. But that would get my mind thinking and I would be afraid. You know what I mean? What happens if I do die? I know you're too super young to be thinking about that, but that was like literally the case for me. I always thought about that stuff. What happens afterward? Obviously, we'll never know until it happens to us. But that was always the case for me. It came from the religious side of it, and it really, I don't want to say this in a bad way. It kind of shapes how you are as a person, if that makes sense. Just the fear of the concept of being punished because you did something bad. Not saying that I was a bad kid, but even making a mistake, it's like, oh geez, like you actually worry about it. And I don't mean to ramble, but going into like my teen years and in my 20s, like I feel like when I was younger, that was definitely a thing I always thought about. Like I'd be laying in bed at night and it would just randomly pop up in your head. I don't know if you've had that experience as well, but that was really a case for me. But like you, I'm in my 30s as well, and I really don't think about it as much in that sense. I think once you hit 30, for some reason, this is just me from my experience, you kind of come to grips with your mortality. Because like some of your older family members are gone, and then you come to the realization like, hey, this is going to happen someday. And you just got to deal with it.
And I think weirdly enough, like 30s for me is like, I feel like even though I feel younger than I think I feel younger now than I did in my 20s, weirdly enough. But I also...
My knees
Your
don't.
knees don't. But I guess I do have some crinks and stuff. Like I can't work out like I used to. But I do feel, and I think the reason why we feel kind of that way, aside from the actual physical changes and ailments and stuff that we're dealing with, like with our bodies and whatever, I think the reason why is because, like you said, we're getting to that point of our lives where kind of getting close to the smack dab in the middle. So we're far away from the beginning and we're hopefully far away from the end. And we're really focusing on our families and careers. And that's like giving us like a rejuvenated energy. We're kind of going down a rabbit hole. I was hoping to bring, because you actually had a perfect segue earlier. You were talking about when you were thinking about life after death when you were younger and stuff. And what does that mean? I think it's a good point to maybe jump into some stories or exposures that we've had with like near-death experiences. I've personally never had one, obviously, because I would probably be a very different person if I did. But I have talked to some people who have, like three degrees of separation. I knew a person who knew a person who had an experience like that. But the one thing that I always tether it to this whole concept of life after death is anything we experience in ourselves. It inherently comes. God damn it. I said inherently. Any experience like life after death is completely framed by our experiences in our lives and the makeup of our brain and the things that are imprinted in the neurons or whatever. So, but I think one really interesting thing to do would be to look and see if there truly is anybody from other religions or other practicing beliefs or spiritualities who had an experience, life after death experience or near death experience that was like completely different from how they were brought up and whatever religion they believe in. Today, we're going to talk about stories like history and near-death experiences and like the concept of hell, the concept of heaven, the concept of rebirth in Buddhism and Sikhism, Jainism, Hinduism, and stuff like that. What direction do you want to talk about first? Do you want to just jump in with like an example of what's the most intriguing example you've heard for like near-death experiences?
So I do have a secondhand near-death experience that I'm glad you brought up, that you've actually talked to people that have spoken to people. So this comes from my mom's side of the family. Apparently, one of my aunts, my mom's older sister, my mom has 9 other siblings. Wow. They're all sisters. Yeah.
Your poor grandfather.
So she told me that one of her sisters was struck by lightning, and that for the few seconds, I guess that they were few seconds or minutes, I'm not sure how long it was. This happened so long ago when I was told this story, that she died and went to heaven and saw her family members. They were basically telling her like, hey, you have to go back, it's not your time. And she basically said that she wanted to stay with them because, you felt overwhelming love and that she should be there to be with her loved ones from the past. That was kind of the gist of it from what I heard from what she experienced. Now, not trying to discredit anybody, but I don't know if that's something within the brain that happens that, forces us to think in that way. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on that, but just something that I always kept in mind, because they always say like when someone passes away, the last thing to go, the last organ to go is their brain. Yeah. So I wonder if that's one of those things where the brain is a defense mechanism, has a defense mechanism, that last gasp to hold on to life or something of that sort. I'm no scientific expert on it, so my explanation might be completely wrong. Yeah, that is one of the near-death experiences that I know of personally that happened in my family.
That's interesting, man.
Do you have any?
No, but one thing that you kind of touched on that is interesting is, so you're saying how she went to heaven and she got to meet her loved ones. And man, my analytic brain, like I can't help but think about what the implications of all that is. Because I mean, if you think about it, if she, I think her, it sounds like in her story, and I know other stories, people see a loved one like in their mind, right? Or like wherever they go, they see a physical image of them that looks like how they remember them. So
right,
obviously that's not matter, like actual physical matter that they're seeing, like the person used to exist in this three-dimensional space or whatever. So to me, that kind of just screams like a manifested representation in the brain. So, I mean, it really depends on what the nature of existence is and in the universe, like, how energies are made up. And I know there are theories out there about how, when we pass away, the neurons and the energy that make up the makeup of our brain or whatever kind of disperses. I guess it's possible that it's contained in a sense, like an imprint, that we have a memory or a continuation of the soul after life. But in my mind, when I think about someone seeing a loved one in the afterlife, it's like, why are they frozen in that state of time? Someone sees them, like, they see your grandfather, you're going to remember your grandfather looks like he's 80 or 70. No one talks about like, oh, I saw my grandfather, but he looked like a 12-year-old boy or something. You know what I mean? Like, so when you died, you just get like frozen in that state, in that age or whatever. And that's the other, like, it's kind of sad to talk about, when people die at different ages and they leave this world, if there is another place that they go, do they keep growing? Like, does their brain keep absorbing, or not their brain, but their like spirit keep absorbing information, and then like is time linear, or do you kind of just like understand everything at once when you die? So those are like questions I like to think about when we bring up like near-death experiences. To be honest with you, man, like I think it's interesting that we should talk about like the negative, scary stories of like people going to hell and stuff like that, because it's part of the conversation. But me personally, like some of the feelings that I felt about death when I was younger were more like kind of altruistic in a sense. When I would look up, like, I don't know, a lot of people experience different things, but when I look up at the stars, even today, but especially when I was younger, like I just got this, you get this feeling in your soul, like in your gut or whatever that feeling is, like you just feel connected to everything. And not everybody gets to experience that, but I think that's something that is really important in our personal and spiritual growth, is to kind of like, when you just look up at the stars or you think about the concept of life after death, and you kind of just get this like kind of takes your breath away sort of thing, So anyway, to back to the lightning strike story, I think that I can't possibly judge or know what the actual experience was, but I think maybe one other direction we can take this possibly is, you were saying before we got on this call that you have learned some stories, like historic stories about people experiencing life after death and stuff like that. Do you have like a favorite one or a really interesting one that pops out from history?
One that I found interesting was the Howard Storm's account. So Howard Storm, he accounts near-death experience. So long story short, he died and came back to life. And while he was dead, he said that he went to hell. When he went to hell, he said that he encountered demonic beings, malevolent and terrifying creatures that he identified as demons. According to his account, these beings would torment him physically and emotionally, inflicting pain and fear. Before I continue, I forgot to mention that Howard Storm, prior to his near-death experience, was a staunch atheist. So keep in mind that this is someone that's an atheist, doesn't believe in the afterlife, having an experience of hell. The Storm goes on to recount that he said the environment in hell was dark, gloomy. It was filled with hopelessness. There was just always a sense of despair, and he thought he was going to be trapped there. He also said that demonic beings were attacking him and tormenting him relentlessly, and the attacks weren't just physical assaults on his body. They were psychological assaults on him as well. Storm also said that he called out for help while he was being tormented, and obviously his pleas for help went unanswered. And then he said he felt this just overwhelming sense of loneliness and isolation and being abandoned. And he said that after enduring the torment, he said that he had some sort of transformational experience when he began to pray. And then he said that when he started praying, this spiritual presence appeared and took him out of hell. That is what led him to change his beliefs and values to now be a believer.
Yeah. One thing that jumps out to me from that story is, I know he likes to like kind of frame it and say that he was an atheist beforehand. And I guess you could only take that story with a grain of salt because we don't know this person and we don't know what kind of like things he went through in his life. But clearly he knew about Christianity before this happened. He knew about Jesus. He must have, because he said he prayed to Jesus or, experienced Jesus or whatever. So
plus he was an academic, so you would expect them to have some sort of baseline knowledge of that as well.
Yeah. So I suppose it's, possible that the experience was kind of rooted deep down in his subconscious. So when he had the near-death experience, maybe it's something he thought about. He might have still been afraid of like life after death and stuff, and he might have grown up learning about Christianity and stuff. So maybe it's possible that he took the stories that he did know about and kind of imprinted them on his conscious or subconsciousness when he had that experience that kind of gave him a religious transformation. And the reason why I like to like kind of take it back to that concept of it's all about the environment in which you grew up. And that is a good example to kind of like address what I brought up earlier. Like, I wonder if there's a near-death experience of like someone in, I don't know, like Jaipur or something, somewhere in India or somewhere like, staunch Hindu, and then, or Muslim or something. And then they suddenly died. And then they had a story about meeting like the Buddha, or they had a story like, let's say a Hindu died and actually met Jesus, or, and they suddenly had some story that brought it back to Christianity or something like that when they didn't have any knowledge of Christianity to begin with. That's what I always go back to when I think about stories like this. But the whole concept of like hell in and of itself, I've actually heard stories about, reading stories about people experiencing that. And especially when I was like learning about Christianity when I was younger, I do remember stories about people talking about how like, oh, they saw like, there was this really dark one, they saw people burning in lakes of fire. But that's the funny thing is like, everybody's story is different. And what does that mean? So this guy talked about like, being tormented, and there seemed to be like a time component where like, there was some pain put on him, and then the pain stopped, and then it switched like psychological, physical pain. So there were things that were transgressing in a temporal state in his experience. But then there's other people who just talk about it as just being constant fire, and that's it. So I think this is the perfect segue to talk about another interesting concept, which is there are different stages and levels people talk about in different religions after life, like life after, not just hell, but heaven too. I'll just give a quick example. So one of my favorite reads that I touched on years and years ago, like studying religion, was the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they basically talk about various stages that are like kind of realms, so to speak, that a person passes through right after death. And I don't really know too much in depth about it, but I think essentially what it's talking about is the rebirth, the death and the rebirth cycle. If I had to guess, man, I would think that being reborn in a way makes more sense than just going somewhere permanently afterwards, because there are so many other moving parts to going somewhere and being permanently. Do you continue learning things? Do you continue experiencing time? But when it comes to like life after death and rebirth, that kind of makes more sense because your energy is always transitioning to another state. So in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they talk about like right after death, you kind of just go into this conscious state of kind of like hallucinatory state that other people talk about with near-death experiences. And then you go into this next stage where you feel peaceful, you experience peace or wrath, or depending on whatever figures are in your mind. Like, some people talk about seeing different types of angels or demons like you were talking about. And then the next stage is basically confronting their past actions. Their unresolved desires basically drove them to do what they did in their life. And then, of course, the final stage is, where do you end up? Do you go back into another body to learn another lesson, or how does that work? I don't know. Have you ever heard any near-death experiences of people who were like Buddhist or Hindu or something like that, where it's a completely different structure of like life after death in their religion?
I can't say that I have personally of anyone that from a different faith that had a near-death experience from those specific faiths. Unfortunately, I only have the one account from my family member, and it's from the perspective of a Catholic person.
Right.
But what I do know with Hindus, they do believe in the reincarnation cycle,
right,
based off of your karma and your dharma.
So I'm just learning now. I'm looking it up. There are some near-death experiences from, like, let's say, other religions that are outside the Judeo-Christian structure of like one God. In the Hindu religion, there are some stories. An American author named Daniel Brinkley had a near-death experience. Interestingly enough, being struck by lightning. And he reported that he traveled through a tunnel, which is pretty traditional in a lot of experiences. And he encountered deceased relatives. And basically, I mean, there's not too much detail in this, but it says that he's not specifically Hindu, but he shared accounts of experiences that sounded within the realm of the Hindu faith. So that's just, I mean, there you go. That's one example of like someone who is outside of the religion, or another example, I should say, because it's kind of in the same vein of that one professor who was an atheist and then became Christian. I don't know how this person, Danny and Brinkley, I don't know how they approached Hinduism after that experience. Maybe they adopted Hinduism or something like that. But it's just so interesting, isn't it? Like, there are so many different experiences that are based off of, that come from the things that we experience in our day-to-day lives. Like, I know so much about different religions. So I wonder, whenever I do face that moment, which one will win out in my head, my consciousness or whatever. But I want to talk about really quickly, if you're interested in going down this road, the actual things that people see like right at the moment of death, because this is kind of like reading that last example with the tunnel and then hearing the story about people traveling to another place and experiencing a bright light, which is also nuanced in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So that's one thing that we can kind of like bridge the gap between spirituality and then like the physical state of what might be happening in the brain at the moment of death. Almost everybody who has a near-death experience talks about having like seeing a tunnel and then seeing like a bright light. So I think that if there is some kind of spiritual traveling, it does make sense that it would look like a tunnel or something like that. Because if you look in space, like out into space, light travels in a straight line. It's possible, like in like Star Wars or something, when they hit, or like warp drive, or when they go into hyperdrive or whatever, how the stars, like they do that cool line thing because like you're moving so fast that all the light just like blurs out. And I don't know if that's what really happens when you travel at the speed of light, but that kind of is reminiscent of like a tunnel. So maybe it is possible that you really do transition to another state, like your spiritual state travels on some kind of form of light or energy, and it's like almost instantaneous, or like, at the speed of light or something like that. But then, of course, on the other end, it could also just be it's your brain closing in on itself, like your perception, like literally closing the gap around you. And that is the picture of the tunnel. Because, if anyone who's ever blacked out, you start blacking out, the darkness comes around the sides of your eyes, the sides of your perception first, not in the center of your eyes. So it's kind of like a closing in sort of thing. So that might also be why some people experience a tunnel and then maybe a bright light because they're looking straight through that tunnel at the last light that they're seeing ahead. What are your thoughts, man? Like, I'm kind of talking like down a hole here.
No, I think you made a good observation there, especially with the light in the tunnel. And I think your explanation of blacking out, that makes sense to me, because when people say they die and they have a near death experience and they come back, they always talk about that tunnel of light, like you said. So it could well be that your brain is going through that process of your peripherals are shutting down, things are just shutting down, and all that's left is what you see directly in front of you, which slowly starts to fade away, if that makes sense. I think that it makes sense from that perspective. And it's, like you said, a lot of people, when they say people pass away and they come back, they always report that tunnel of light. Speaking of that tunnel of light, I was scrolling through TikTok the other day and I came across a clip of, I forget which podcast it was. It might have been Joe Rogan, and they were talking about life after death. And the one guy in the clip that was Joe Rogan's guest talked about exactly that. And he's like, what most people do is that they'll go to the light. And he's like, what you should probably do is most people don't turn around. And when you turn around, you see the universe behind you. So this guy went on to say that if you go to the light, it starts the cycle of your soul coming back to Earth. Like that keeps the cycle going.
Like reincarnation?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. That's kind of what he was saying without saying reincarnation. And that if you turned around, you would basically go out into the universe. Yeah. That was the first time I've ever heard of that. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a whole, oh man, that's like, I've never thought about that actually. So like if you're traveling in the light after death and you're going, I never thought of the concept of leaving the actual physical universe. That's actually a mind blowing concept that if you, like when you die, that you leave this plane altogether and you're instantaneously or near instantaneously finding yourself outside of the known universe. But everything that exists that we know of is in this universe, even the concept of like multiple universes stacked on top of each other, like the multiverse theory. So that is, I mean, when I hear a story like that kind of just like, I can't think of a specific good example, but I know there are like shows that have, or like movies that have done this where like, in especially comedy shows, I think The Simpsons did it. I think maybe Rick and Morty did it. It's like when you step outside of the door of the universe, you just enter this room and it's just like a white room. Like there's just nothing in there. And like maybe that actually can tie into the concept of purgatory as well, right? Because like the holding place, like the place where you go when you're waiting for judgment or to be reborn or something like that. But the thing that I find the most interesting from all this conversation is like what is actually happening to your mind. So let's say hypothetically, you do travel through that tunnel and you turn around and you see the universe behind you. But what if you keep going? You decide to keep going and you leave the universe or you go to that other plane of existence. One thing that no one ever talks about when we talk about this sort of thing is like the universe is I keep saying this word, but I have to keep bringing it up because it's such an important part. So temporal. Everything is based on time here. It's linear that we know of. So everything that we experience is it's stages 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, progression forward, can't go back. But when you leave that plane of existence, and by the way, like our brains, like the people that we are and that we become is very much based in that time state. It's basically we have experiences, we have memories that get repeated or whatever, and then that's who we are as a person. But what does it mean when you leave that temporal state? Like what happens to your brain, or not your brain? I keep saying brain. What I really mean is your consciousness. What happens to your consciousness when you leave that state of like A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 progression? Because you need that progression in order for your consciousness to take on information and to change and think. and it's all very much relative. So I don't know, like I'm always skeptical when people talk about near-death experiences like that, because they're always talking about understanding it from the perspective of like there's still a time-based factor, because there's always the idea of like the forever factor if there's no reincarnation. So I don't know, like there has to be there has to be some kind of explainable measure for it, because you never hear someone come back and say, oh my God, I experienced something and there's just no way for me to explain it. That would make sense. That would make sense for someone to leave the universe or leave their body to go to another plane of existence and have it be outside of time. And then if they come back after experiencing that, there would be no way for you to explain that. You don't have a concept outside of the temporal state of three-dimensional space that can explain that.
We've mentioned reincarnation multiple times. What are your thoughts on that in general? Do you believe that's a thing?
Yeah, I just can't decide. Like when I was younger and I believed in Christianity and stuff, I can safely say, and I'm not taking a shot at anybody who's Christian or believes in one religion. I think, everyone's entitled to that, and I respect and I appreciate that everybody or other people have their specific belief structures. But for me, as I got older and my mind kind of opened up to different religions and different ways of thinking, and that's what really nudged me to leave the devoted concept of Christianity itself. Maybe I don't know, man, it could be maybe it is the true state of nature. But you have to, if you accept that Christianity can be the true state of nature, you also have to admit that it's possible that another religion is the true state of nature. Like we could be talking about heathens, right? Yeah, no. But seriously, man, think about it. Like if there are so many other religions, and even in Christianity, there are different stages of Christianity in history. So like a Christian that exists today, like let's say like a New Age Christian, the people who go to those really awesome like churches where they sing and they dance and they put their hands in the air and they really like try to get to that spiritual happy worship state. But then what if that person who is Christian today could go back in time and talk to someone who was like a devout, quiet, like a monk who took a vow of silence, and they have the rosary or they prayer beads, and they're both Christian. They both believe in Jesus. They both believe in God, heaven and hell. However, completely different states and stages of structure. So once I understood that, and I also put that into the context of the entire world and all the other religions and all the other variations of religions that have ever happened or that will happen in the future, there's just no way for me to say one way or the other. Back to your question, I think that if I had to choose what one belief makes the most sense, and like I said earlier in the conversation, I think it would have to be reincarnation or some form of reincarnation, because I just basically get that from looking at the universe around me. Like, yeah, sure, there are stories of people who experience like heaven and hell after they die in, Muslim or Christian, or maybe even Jewish faith in the Judeo-Christian realm. But I also think that if we're looking around the universe as we exist now, everything we're experiencing in the universe in this three-dimensional space and time, we see energy constantly moving. Like even our physical bodies, like the physical part of our bodies get broken down and recycled. So even though we look and feel pretty much the same throughout the years of our lives, the particles that make up our body are different, completely different. We took on energy through food and sunlight or whatever other energy sources, and that generated the cells in our bodies, but those cells die out and they get recycled. So we're literally comprised of an entirely different set of cells and stuff that were different from our earliest points of life. So maybe that's another way to look at life after death. The transitionary state between when you're younger and older is the same as spirituality, where you leave your body, you are comprised of a different energy, but you're still yourself. But that is the one issue with reincarnation that I have, which is if you are reincarnated, like let's say someone dies and they are like that. Let's say Bob is 45 years old. He works at an insurance company and he has 2 kids and whatever. He is the person that he is. He likes football. He likes TV, funny TV shows, whatever. So that's the physical makeup of Bob. And that's his brain. That's his mind. That's everything that he is. If reincarnation is real and he dies, let's say he goes and experiences and comes to face the fact, like in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, like everything he did in his life, good and bad. And then they do the whole weigh him against a feather. He's lighter than a feather. He comes back as, I don't know, who's a really super handsome, like really rich person in this world, like some movie star or something. Matthew McConaughey. Oh my God. Love to have a beer with that guy. Okay. So let's say, Bob knocks it out of the park. He comes back as Matthew McConaughey. However, Matthew McConaughey is not Bob. He's completely, maybe there are some like imprints from Bob's life, but completely different person. So that's the one issue I have with reincarnation is essentially, if that's how it works, then you kind of are dying permanently, because the state of yourself that exists in this moment, if you just die and then you get reincarnated as something else or someone else, then the state of being that you are really is experiencing oblivion, because you're not going to like die as Bob and then come back as baby Bob with the exact same person, right? So I don't know, that's the one issue I have with that. How do you feel about that?
I actually thought of something while you were talking about reincarnation and sharing your perspective. What you said there, that when essentially, if reincarnation is real, Bob died, right? And then reincarnates as someone else. Bob is in oblivion. Bob doesn't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. What I was thinking was the soul still remembers Bob.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Sure.
Now, let me put it this way. This is going to be the only reason I use this example that I'm going to use right now is because you and I have been gaming our entire lives, right? Let's say we're playing an RPG and you max out a character. You have other created character slots. It's you as the player controlling those characters and creating those characters could technically be the soul. And then you choose to build a vessel, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm explaining it horribly.
No, I get it.
But that's the one thing that came to mind. The soul is the person actually, the thing actually playing the game, and then it chooses to go into another character to learn a different thing or to experience a different thing, if that makes sense.
That's a beautiful concept. I mean, I think if reincarnation is the true state of nature and like how things work when you die, I think that is kind of a beautiful and interesting concept that kind of makes me feel better about it. Because honestly, man, like I think the one thing that people are scared about the most when thinking, or not, I can't say that because everybody has their own fears, but I think, at least for me, a big fear about death isn't necessarily where we go after. It's the idea that it could be the end of everything. And that's like oblivion, man. And I have, like, I've woken up out of a state of sleep, like gasping for air, because in that exact moment of coming back to reality, I suddenly just am ultra aware of the fact that I exist, coming out of sleep. And there must be some kind of deep state of bother that I think about subconsciously here. And that doesn't happen all the time, but it's definitely something I've experienced before, where I kind of just like snap back to reality and I just go like, oh, like, holy crap, I'm alive. Like, this is life. This is everything. You know, like I was just unconscious. I was essentially gone because I have no memory of being unconscious and sleeping. So that to me is frightening. But at the same time, I brought that up to a friend of mine years ago, and I'll never forget what he said back to me. It's like, well, you know, that's scary. I can see why that's scary, but you also have to think about, do you have any memory of fear or anything before you were born or before your earliest memory? No. So, I mean, and as I get older, I kind of look, and this is, I'm sorry to everybody, this is kind of becoming like a psychological, like, or a psychology session, but I'm thinking as I get older, I'm becoming more and more okay with the idea that I came to this life. I've had a good life so far. I can't complain. I've had ups and downs, but I essentially have been, you know, lucky in a lot of ways. And I've got to experience a lot of things that I wanted to experience. So how could I possibly complain that if I go, that's just the end of me completely? And it's hard to say out loud because there are so many people so many things I like doing here and so many people I love that I want to keep experiencing for a long, long time. But that is just one concept that I think about is, you know, either you're here or you're not here. and anything after that or before that is irrelevant. So if you leave this state and you go into another state, like your energy, reincarnation actually is real to a degree, right? Because the energy that it comprises of our brain, like comprises our brain and body when we die, is going to leave our body, and it's going to go, the energy is going to go into something else. So essentially that's kind of reincarnation, right? I won't keep going off on a tangent, but maybe I can bring it back to the near-death experience thing real quick, which is going back to the example of people experiencing like heaven or hell after they die, or seeing loved ones. That obviously isn't reincarnation, unless you want to have this idea. And that's the other thing too I wanted to bring up that's super interesting is, imagine reality. Maybe there is a being that controls reality that we could think of like God, but maybe that being caters to everybody's different beliefs by projecting a certain belief. And in that way, all the religions could be true. You know, like what if the entity that controls our universe, that made our universe, sees a person and they are like a devout person, they have beliefs. Maybe that entity can create a state that you believe in after you die just for you. And that can, that being can create different states for different people who believe in different religions. So there could be a heaven, there could be a hell in different states. There could be a reincarnation or whatever you want to believe in. Maybe that entity creates it for you. But the problem with that is, if you have, like, let's say that entity, or let's say someone dies and goes to heaven and they get to see their loved ones again. Are those loved ones actually their loved ones? Or are they just projections of the being? And in that way, it's not real. It's not real like you're experiencing the loved ones when they were alive, because they were actually physically made up of something that you could reach out and touch just like you. But if you go to another plane of existence and anything you experience at that moment outside of reality, you can no longer trust that it's actually factual. And that goes, I think that can actually, we can even jump all the way back if we wanted to and touch on the whole concept of like AI and virtual reality that we did, episodes ago. And remember when I brought that up, it's like we're getting to a point with AI where, you can no longer prove that what you're seeing or who you're talking to is the actual person or thing you're experiencing. And I think that once you bring that concept into death, then that's the same thing where you die, you see a loved one or you see hell, but maybe it's not actually the thing you're experiencing. Maybe it's just a manifestation that your brain creates in that moment, or maybe there's some spiritual being that is catering to your belief structure.
That's a deep one that I have thought about, but I didn't think about it in that fashion.
How'd you think about it?
I thought of it in the sense that, okay, there's a creator or God. Understand that everyone has different beliefs based off of where they're from. And I think if you're a good person, you should be able to go into your paradise or equivalent, if that makes sense. And the reason that I think that is because go back 1,000 years and think about the Buddhist monk or a Hindu yogi that knows absolutely nothing about Christianity or Islam. Yes. And they live their life. They live a good life. They never hurt anything. They never kill any animals. They take care of people. They take care of animals. They are the paragon of virtue. They do everything that you're supposed to do as a human being to be good to another person. And then they die. Would it be right for them to go to hell because they didn't know about? Because they didn't know, there was an absence of knowledge.
Yes. Oh man, you just brought back a memory about like my growth and like turning away from Christianity. Like that is one concept that really drove me to step outside of the Christian faith, because I totally agree with you. And that's what happens when people get narrow, not to go off on a tangent, but like that's what happens when people get so narrow-minded and closed-minded. They want the thing that they believe in to be true to the point where we talked about this before. It's cognitive dissonance, like you have one thought in your head, right. And I've talked, there are actual people that I talk to who believe this or believe this back then, like really hardcore Christians, like born again Christian level. They honestly believe that God can be love and God can be all loving. Jesus is love. Jesus is there to save everybody. Yet there's also the dichotomy or the other side of it, which is God can send someone to hell permanently. a permanent state of suffering for not going to Christ. And some of these people that I talked to truly believed that it doesn't matter that you were born into another religion, or you like you said, maybe you were a paragon of virtue in another religion 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago was still 1,220 years or so after the supposed death of Jesus. So that's a long time to be around. Let's say hypothetically someone did hear about Jesus in the story of Christianity, but they just brushed it off. By that theory or belief structure in Christianity by some of those people, that was enough of a chance, like God giving someone a chance to go down the actual righteous path towards Christianity. So once that person learned about Jesus and turned away from Jesus, and even if they continued to live a good life, that's game on for those people who believed Christianity to that point, for that person to go to hell, which I do not agree with. Like you said, there's a whole alteration or transition in different religions over the course of millennia, or a long, long time. So like you said, if you go back 1,000 years or so and you try to talk to somebody who has no basis of or understanding of Christianity today, or even maybe at all, is it right for them to go to hell? But if I can go down that vein, same vein, but a different concept, which is, imagine if someone who died 1,200 or 1,500 years ago, who is like a family member, like, a great, et cetera, aunt or uncle or whatever. And then you go meet that person in heaven after you die. Is that person like you? I mean, you and I, like, we grew up loving, like, what are some things we love to do? We love to play games. We love to eat pizza. We love to drink every once in a while. But there wasn't even pizza back then. There certainly wasn't video games back then. So, like, does that mean when we go to heaven, will we get to introduce our 1,500-year-old ancestors who don't know what pizza and gaming is? And will they even like it? Because, like, everyone's heaven will be different, right? So if, like, someone goes to heaven, your heaven, which is, but then again, I don't know, man. Like, I guess you can also talk about the idea that heaven doesn't inherently have to be, I said it again, this is going to be a running gag. This is going to be our, how like the Always Sunny podcast, which is a podcast I love listening to. They do the cut that. That's going to be our thing. We're going to get little coffee mugs that say inherently on them, because I can't fucking stop saying inherently. I hear it from now on forever and ever. It's just ruined.
If I was taking shots, I'd probably be passed out right now. Yeah.
You'd be on the floor. But yeah, man, like, that's like, but going back to the idea of life after death, I guess, I have heard the argument that when people die and they go to, like, heaven, that doesn't necessarily mean that, heaven isn't necessarily someplace you get to go do all the fun things you like to do in life. It can just be a transitionary state that you're stepping above and beyond all those things that made you happy, and you're letting them go, and you're entering in a new state of, like, happiness. But also in that sense, like, you're not really you anymore. You're not yourself anymore, which is kind of also like a state of death, after life after death, if that makes sense. So I don't know, man. I swear to God, like, my analyst brain will not let me not think about these points. And that's why it's probably, ignorance is probably really is bliss for a lot of people, because, people just accept things the way that they are. Maybe they're happier. I don't know.
It's very easy to be simple and just accept and believe and, be more structured in your life, because when you start to question things, when you start to look for answers, or, like you said, we both have analytical brains, you go down these rabbit holes and you start asking these questions, and then it's like, okay, why the hell am I doing this? What is the point of this? Why do people do this? I don't want to shit on anybody, but I think it's very easy for people to just keep it simple. And I think that's what most people want.
But
they just want to keep it simple.
And the problem with that, though, is the simplicity is how I think we get to, as human beings, all the concepts and different things that we make up in different religions, because it's so much simpler to come up with a story that explains what the nature of existence is, as opposed to actually thinking about the different possibilities. And I think that's exactly how we got to this state in so many religions, having so many stories that are stacked on each other. And it gets to a point sometimes that I have to laugh, because it's almost like the Marvel universe. Like, we live in this stage where, like, people created these amazing multi-layered universes, or in the Marvel universe or DC comic universe or whatever. Like, all these stories are stacked upon each other, and it really creates, like, down to the most nuanced detail about, like, what a character, like, eats, and, like, what their backstory was, what's their favorite socks that they like to wear, like all the way down in that level of detail. And it just keeps getting stacked and stacked. And I think that's what happens in religion, especially with like near-death experiences or like with life after death or whatever. People just keep making up things to explain away the questions that other people have. It's like, I know this isn't actually going to be something like, I don't really know the angels and demons in Christianity, but I think you probably know more than I do. But it's like, it's like, oh, there's a demon that makes you hungry, and like it makes you starve to death or something, and that demon that demon is responsible for making people starve to death. Oh, okay. Well, then what about when people eat? Does that demon go, oh, well, in that case, there's an angel of food and the angel of food, you know what I mean? So it's like everyone's always making stories to go down different paths and stuff. And I think that's this, and to tie it back to the life after death thing, it's the same concept. It's like people keep adding on to these stories about like what they experience. It's like, oh, this guy who went to hell, who was an academic, he was not only physically tortured, but psychologically tortured, which is something you don't hear about in past accounts of hell from like Dante's Inferno or something, like you literally just get poked with a stick or whatever. So I guess you can argue that there could be like layers of existence after death in different states.
Dante's Inferno is worse.
Is it? Okay.
Have you read the Divine Comedy?
A long time ago. I don't really remember it.
If you don't want to read it, if you like audiobooks, it's on Audible. I recommend it. But the descriptions from Dante Alighieri for the 9 Circles of Hell, it's pretty interesting. So I would suggest giving that a read.
Okay. But what are like, we don't have to go through all of them because I'm sure it's going to take forever to go through every stage or whatever, but like, let's talk about the extremes. Like what's the like, aside, I think there's purgatory, right? But like, what's the first step down from purgatory? Is that kind of just like a sore like knee or like what is that? And then what's the worst?
So purgatory is in between heaven and hell. Purgatory is for people that need to purge themselves. I guess they're like good people, but did some bad things and they're repenting. So it's a place for souls to repent. But in Dante's Inferno, there are 9 circles of hell. For our listeners, the Divine Comedy was a poem written by Dante Alighieri, I think in like the 1300s or the 1400s, in which he said that the poet Virgil, which was a Roman poet who wrote the Aeneid, you can Google him, he's a very interesting character, takes him on a tour through hell. So the first circle is limbo, and that is where the unbaptized and virtuous pagans are. So this is where you'll find Ovid, Socrates, Plato, Saladin, people like that. The second circle is lust. I think that's self-explanatory. The third circle is gluttony, self-explanatory. The fourth circle is avarice and prodigality. In this fourth circle, the miserly and the spendthrift push great heavy weights together, crashing them time and time again. Plutus guards them. In the fifth circle, wrath and sullenness. The wrathful fight each other on the surface of the Styx, while the sullen gurgle beneath it. The sixth circle is heresy. The heretics are trapped in flaming tombs. The seventh circle is violence. This is reserved for people that are violent against people, property, blasphemers, sodomites. The eighth circle is fraud. So false prophets, liars, thieves. And the ninth circle is treachery. And this is for people such as Judas and Brutus and Cassius. So for those that are not familiar with Brutus and Cassius, they were the main conspirators that backstabbed and murdered Julius Caesar. And Satan relies in the ninth circle of hell.
And what, whenever, I'm guessing, it was based off of Christianity, right?
Yeah, it was basically written as an indirect attack on the strong ruling class I think this was written during the Renaissance for the powerful families of Florence. Yeah. And those families were known for their lustful behavior, their greedy behavior. So that's kind of how this came about, without Dante directly saying like, hey, you guys are assholes, so he wouldn't get killed.
So, but essentially this was kind of like also a writing like tongue-in-cheek sort of thing. It wasn't meant to be taken literal.
Right. It wasn't meant to be taken literally.
So that's,
But but people
Yeah,
do.
exactly. Oh, okay. Thank you. I was just going to bring that up. That's what I think happens a lot of the time with religion and the concept of life after death is like, just like the whole example I gave with the Marvel universe or whatever, like people make up these stories or they come up with these stories or it's just an amalgamation or like a compounding of different stories put into a text or a book or something that keeps getting added onto. And then people take that as fact. See, that's why I have to bring it back to an interesting concept, which is like we talked about earlier, the idea that whenever people experience life after death, especially like heaven or hell, I would love to have been able to, or would be able to talk to these people to ask them what their exposure to or understanding of the Christian religion was before they had this experience. It makes sense if someone grew up Christian and they were really hardcore Christian and they said they went and met their loved ones in Jesus and then they came back or whatever wasn't their time. That makes sense. But I don't mean to keep going back to this same example, but the atheist professor who turned Christian after experiencing hell or whatever and praying to Jesus, like I would love to talk to someone like that and be like, hey, well, that's interesting. But I really want to ask you, is what was your exposure to Christianity and understanding of it beforehand? Did you ever, like, even though you're an atheist, did you ever think about Christianity as being possible? Like, did you grow up or did you grow up in a state of your family that was around you and you kind of just turned away from it? And in that sense, that might help explain how someone can take these stories that they had, and even though they had a belief in that moment that they, when they come to that near death experience, then they have a completely 180 experience, and then they actually experience heaven or hell or whatever. But yeah, so like the psychological concept that is basically fed off of and built on top of multiple stories over like hundreds of thousands of years or whatever. I want to go back real quick while we still have time, if there is time. Can we go back really quickly to like before Christianity? You're more of a historian than I am.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As I've said before, I like classical history. I like Greek mythology and the ancient Roman world. Their afterlife is very interesting in the sense that there is Tartarus, which is the hell equivalent. There is Hades, which one could say is the purgatory equivalent. And then there are the fields of Elysium, which is the heaven equivalent. But for all intents and purposes, when people die, unless you're like a terrible creature or a very, very vile person, everybody just goes to Hades. Like,
yeah, everybody. I remember hearing that. That's just sucks. Like you can like work your whole life being a slave or whatever, and you can just try to be a good person. You still got to go to Hades. That's terrible, man. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and in the Odyssey, Odysseus has to go to Hades because he has to talk to a prophet that's dead. The blind prophet, I think, he has to talk to.
I remember that now.
I think, oh God, what is his name? Like Tiresias or something
like that.
The blind prophet. Yes. So I should know better because I love this story. That the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're among my favorites, but they're just so many names. So Odysseus takes a sacrifice with him. He has to take a lamb, unfortunately. And while he's walking through Hades to find Tiresias and fending off the dead, trying to get the blood of the lamb, he sees Achilles. I think he sees Agamemnon. So Ajax, all of the quote unquote heroes that he fought alongside with during the Trojan War, what were they
doing? I know Hades is not the same concept as hell, but it's kind of in the same vein. So what do you do in Hades back then? Like in that story, like what were they doing?
They just roam around. Their souls they're just there. That's just just there. That's just where the souls went. That's where Hades shepherded them. And that's where the three-headed dog Cerberus guards them so they don't try to leave the realm to go back to that of the living. So Hades in that concept is not a bad thing. It's not a place of punishment. It's just a place where the god of the dead goes to overwatch souls to make sure nothing happens to them. But Hades is not hell. Yeah. Hades is just the world of the dead, just the underworld. Tartarus is the place where unspeakable creatures are, and like the very, very vile and the very wicked. And that's where the punishments happen. I can't remember the name, but there's a story of this guy trying to outwit a god, and for all eternity he has to push a rock up a hill, and when he gets to the top of the hill, it rolls back down. I'm pretty sure he's in Tartarus when that's happening. And the fields of Elysium are essentially like, it's really, really, really hard to get into Elysium. The Romans had a different view of Elysium, but to the Greeks, it was very much so like everybody just died and went to Hades. And when you died during your funeral, we'll put a gold coin and your 2 coins on your eyes and 1 under your tongue, so you can pay the ferryman to take you across the river Styx.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
it was pretty simplistic. Yeah,
exactly. That's the same concept coming back again. The simplicity that is getting us in trouble as people, and that's why I apologize for laughing while you're talking. But I was just thinking of like how kind of ridiculous. I'm not taking shots, but like just saying how kind of interesting and in a funny way that idea is. When I hear stories like that, I just think of like some old tired grandfather who's like getting, poked and prodded by his grandkids about like questions, and he's just, oh god damn, well, how do they, okay, what happens when we die? Oh, you go to this place, his Haiti. Oh, okay, well, how do you get there? Oh, well, there's this guy in a boat. Okay, well, do you have to pay him? Yeah, you have to pay him 2 gold coins. You know what I mean? And you just keep adding on to that story over and over again. Because it doesn't make sense. Like you pay a boatman in Haiti, but where does he go spend the money? Does he just have like a mountain of coins that he forever keeps? And then what happens whenever the coins change? Like, is there like a currency difference? It's like, oh, two quarters does not equal 2 Roman legions or whatever. It's like, you actually, if you want to do 2 Roman legions in quarters, that's actually 5 quarters. So.
Sorry, guy, I can't take you across. Like, what do you want me to do? But yeah, I know what you mean. What I wanted to say about that is that's the thing. That's the simplicity of it. That's because you don't know. You have to find an answer to, I guess, fend off those type of questions. Yeah. Like, I love the example that you gave of like the ancient Greek grandpa.
God damn it! All these questions.
All these questions. Yeah. It's one of those things where there's actually like similarities. There's always some sort of like ferrying over. There's always some sort of physical gift that you have to give. It's like, why do I have to pay to die? Like, dude, I just died. Like, just take me over.
They get you coming and going, man. No, I just had a funny thought though. Like, this is kind of terrible, but it's kind of like in the same idea that we're talking about. What if like all the religions are wrong, but there is an ultimate reality of existence? And like, let's say someone is a really staunch Christian or Muslim or Hindu or whatever religion, and they like believe something is going to happen to them after they die, but then they go to this completely different level of reality and existence and story that is not anywhere near anything on Earth, because maybe there's some alien religion out there that is like the true nature. So like when you show up, you go before the tribunal of the 12 cloaked ancients, and they demand retribution in the form of 20 hot dogs and a fleeflorf, and you're like, oh shit, what the hell is a fleeflorf? I don't even know where to get one of those. Like, what if you show up in another, like a different reality or a different afterlife, and it has nothing to do with anything you've ever experienced? I kind of think of that example when I think about if someone who didn't know about Christianity in a different part of the world, like died and went before Jesus. It's like, I don't even know Jesus, let alone the story behind Jesus. That would be like you showing up to an alien tribunal, like I was just saying, and like having no idea what's going on. So that's why,
dude, don't give the Scientologists ammunition. Come on, man.
What's the Zabinu or something? I don't know. Anyway,
yeah, Xenu or some crap like that.
Man.
Yeah, but I actually wanted to talk about that for a second. Not Scientology, but the concept that you brought up of what if this person that never knew about Jesus dies and is brought before Jesus. So let's put it this way, right? Let's say that when you die and you go to the afterlife and your soul goes to whatever, heaven, right? and you are in a place where God is, right? And Jesus is there. And you're supposed to be in a place where everything is already known, if that makes sense. So what if when you die, like your soul, like I gave the example before of the video game character and like different created characters, and your soul being the person, being the one controlling those characters. What if when you die, all the information that you've had in previous lives and whatever information is available out there, the universe that your soul already knew,
merges,
like comes rushing back? Right.
I agree with that, man. I think that if there is a state of nature and reality like after death, I think that regardless of whatever religion, that is probably something that happens. Because, I'll just say briefly, like my favorite afterlife concept or story or whatever, it's not necessarily from any one religion or whatever, but my favorite, I think I brought this up on another podcast, so I apologize to be repetitive, but the idea that maybe there's a pool of consciousness in the universe, or maybe there's pockets of pools of consciousness that are like a mishmash of all the different intelligent and non-intelligent life forms that have ever experienced anything, the energy, like the perception of life or whatever. Our conscious goes back to that pool. And like you said, we're all at that point, the consciousness that was you is now interconnected with everything. So you literally are back to being a part of that whole thing. And that's really hard to conceptualize, because like you're still yourself, but you're also like everything else and everybody else in that pool of consciousness. So I like the idea that maybe this planet that we're on, with all these different people and different thoughts and feelings and structures of belief or whatever, like we just borrow pools of consciousness from different points of the universe. And this is kind of like a proving ground, or like a melting pot, so to speak, of where all the consciousness in the universe kind of comes and hangs out in the same form, because they can't come together for whatever reason and make like a super consciousness. Maybe there's different pockets or whatever. And I think that's similar. That story that that idea I just brought up is kind of similar to the whole idea of like cosmology. So like, the different signs come different star systems or whatever. And I will say briefly, when I was young, I did have this overwhelming sense of connection to something in the universe that was bigger than myself. And it wasn't religious. It wasn't tied to any like deities or anything like that, or heaven or hell. It was just this feeling of like connection and oneness, and like really just like completely open-mindedness, when I would like sit outside at night and look up at the stars, and I would like get this sense to tie back into the universe. Like, and I like to think that maybe we all did come from a different part of the universe, like a different consciousness pool or something. And when we were just born, and the reason why kids are so innocent isn't necessarily because that they don't have the information that they get when they get older, like experiencing and going through life. Maybe the reason why kids are so innocent is because their souls or whatever consciousness, they're still very close to that, because they just came from that. Because when you talk to a little kid, or you talk to kids and you ask them stories, or to tell stories or questions about the universe, and like try to conceptualize like life or whatever, it usually is very beautiful and very simplistic and innocent. And I like to think that maybe, the consciousness that we have in our bodies came from that, and we will go back to that. Like you said, returning to that pool of consciousness and kind of suddenly becoming aware of everything again.
Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast, and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.